The corruption of a world by the Ruinous Powers follows patterns that have repeated across the galaxy for millennia, yet each instance possesses unique characteristics shaped by local conditions, the specific chaos gods involved, and the particular vulnerabilities of the population being corrupted. Understanding how chaos spreads through a planetary population requires examining documented cases where Imperial authorities piece together the progression from initial infection to complete damnation. The mechanisms are consistent enough to identify common stages, even as the specifics vary wildly depending on whether the corruption serves Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh. The earliest documented case of planetary chaos corruption during the Horus Heresy occurred on Isstvan III, a civilized world in the Isstvan system that had been brought into Imperial compliance only 15 years before its fall. The world's corruption began not with dramatic displays of heresy, but with the quiet work of Slaanesh cultists who had maintained their presence even after the Raven Guard's conquest of the system. These cultists operated in the shadows of Isstvan III's society, their activities carefully hidden from Imperial authorities, their membership drawn from individuals who had maintained forbidden practices from the pre-Imperial era, or who had been recruited through promises of experiences and sensations beyond those permitted by the Emperor's rigid doctrine. The planetary governor, Baron Vardus Praal, became the focal point of corruption through methods that demonstrated the insidious nature of Slaaneshi influence. Praal had been appointed by Imperial authorities and initially served with competence, managing the world's compliance and ensuring proper tithes were rendered to the Imperium. His corruption did not begin with overt contact with demons or exposure to warp energies. Instead, it started with human weaknesses that the followers of the Dark Prince understood intimately. Praal was ambitious, vain, and increasingly frustrated by the limitations imposed on his authority by Imperial bureaucracy. He desired recognition, power, and the freedom to shape his world according to his vision rather than the dictates of distant terror. The cultists identified these vulnerabilities and exploited them with patient precision. They approached Praal not as heretics but as allies, influential citizens who shared his frustrations with Imperial governance and offered support for his ambitions. They provided him with resources, political backing, and access to circles of power he had previously been excluded from. They flattered his ego, validated his grievances, and gradually normalized ideas that would have seemed outrageous at the beginning of their association. The process took years, each step so small that Praal could rationalize his choices, convincing himself that he remained a loyal Imperial servant even as he drifted further from the Emperor's light. The gatherings Praal attended began as political salons, where wealthy citizens discussed philosophy and governance. The conversations were sophisticated, intellectual, focused on abstract principles rather than explicit heresy. Questions were raised about the Emperor's vision for humanity, whether his authoritarian approach truly served mankind's interests, whether there might be alternative paths to human advancement that the Imperium's rigid doctrine prevented exploration of. These discussions never advocated chaos directly. They simply encouraged doubt, planted seeds of questioning, created mental space where prohibited ideas could take root. As Praal became more comfortable in these circles, the gatherings evolved. Sensory experiences were introduced, exotic foods and intoxicants from worlds across the Imperium, entertainment that pushed boundaries of propriety, indulgences that the ecclesiarchy would have condemned but which seemed harmless compared to the gross heresies Praal had been taught to fear. The pleasure became habit, became necessity. Praal found himself craving the sensations these gatherings provided, the intensity of experience that made his official duties seem grey and lifeless by comparison. His attendance became compulsive, even as a part of his mind recognized that he was changing, that his priorities were shifting in ways that should have alarmed him. The true corruption accelerated once Praal was psychologically dependent on the experiences the cult provided. The gatherings became more explicitly transgressive, introducing practices that violated Imperial law, rituals that incorporated elements Praal dimly recognized as forbidden, but which he rationalized as symbolic rather than literally heretical. He participated in ceremonies that involved blood offerings, chants in languages he did not understand, sexual practices that violated every stricture of Imperial morality. Each transgression made the next easier to accept, each compromise of principle weakening the internal barriers that might have prompted him to resist. By the time demons were invoked in Praal's presence, He was too far gone to recognize the magnitude of what was happening. The entities that manifested during cult rituals appeared to him as transcendent beings of pure sensation and experience, validating everything the cultists had taught him about the limitations of Imperial doctrine and the greater powers that existed beyond the Emperor's narrow vision. Praal embraced what he now understood to be Slaanesh, though the cultists had been careful never to use that name in his presence until he was ready to accept it. He declared himself a true believer in the Prince of Pleasure, convinced that he had achieved enlightenment rather than damnation. Praal's corruption was nearly complete before he made any overt moves against Imperial authority. For years after his personal fall to chaos, he continued to perform his duties as planetary governor, maintaining appearances of loyalty while gradually using his authority to protect and expand the cult's activities. He appointed cultists to positions of power within the planetary government, ensuring that investigations into heretical activity were misdirected or suppressed. He diverted resources to cult activities under cover of legitimate expenses. He used his influence to isolate or remove officials who might have recognized what was happening, creating a protective shield around the growing corruption. The transition from secret corruption to open rebellion took approximately 6 years from the time Praal's fall was complete. During that period, the Slaaneshi cult expanded from a small group of devotees to a network that penetrated every level of Isstvan III's society. The methodology of expansion mirrored Praal's own corruption, targeting individuals with specific vulnerabilities, offering them experiences and sensations that Imperial society denied, gradually drawing them into deeper involvement until they were irrevocably committed to chaos. The cult did not recruit the desperate or the obviously unstable. Instead, it focused on those with influence, those whose corruption would provide access to resources and protection from Imperial scrutiny. The Warsingers emerged during this period, cultists who had developed or been granted supernatural abilities through their devotion to Slaanesh. These individuals could influence emotions through sound, their voices capable of inducing ecstasy or agony, of breaking wills or inflaming passions. They became the cult's most valuable assets, able to manipulate crowds, enhance ritual effects, and combat enemies through means that conventional Imperial forces could not counter. The Warsingers' abilities demonstrated that Isstvan III's corruption had progressed beyond mere heretical belief into genuine supernatural alteration of reality, the warp bleeding through into the material world in response to the concentrated devotion directed toward the Dark Prince. The planet's infrastructure was gradually repurposed to serve chaos. Temples were constructed in secret, hidden beneath legitimate buildings or disguised as warehouses and storage facilities. The architecture of these spaces was designed according to principles that had nothing to do with human aesthetics, incorporating geometries and proportions that produced psychological effects on those who entered them. Ritual implements were manufactured in factories whose output records were falsified to hide the diversion of resources. Networks of tunnels and hidden passages connected cult facilities, allowing movement that avoided Imperial surveillance. Isstvan III was being transformed into a chaos-worshipping world while maintaining the facade of Imperial loyalty. The Declaration of Independence came when Praal judged that the cult's position was sufficiently strong to survive Imperial response. He publicly renounced the Emperor, declared the Imperium a tyranny built on lies, and proclaimed that Isstvan III would henceforth be free to pursue its own path toward enlightenment. The announcement was accompanied by purges of remaining Imperial loyalists, executions carried out in public squares to demonstrate the new order's power and to terrorize those who might consider resistance. The Warsingers performed during these purges, their abilities ensuring that witnesses experienced the executions not as horrifying atrocities, but as transcendent spectacles, their perceptions warped to interpret murder as art. The Imperial authorities' response was initially disbelief. Isstvan III had shown no signs of unrest, its tithes had been paid, its compliance reports had indicated no problems. The declaration of rebellion seemed to come from nowhere, though in reality it was the culmination of decades of careful preparation. When the truth of the situation became clear, when reports confirmed that an entire world had fallen to chaos worship under the very nose of Imperial governance, the Council of Terror was forced to acknowledge a threat they had not anticipated. The corruption had been too subtle, too patient, operating below the thresholds that Imperial security systems were designed to detect. The mission to retake Isstvan III was assigned to War Master Horus, who commanded 4 full Space Marine legions. What Imperial authorities did not know was that Horus himself had fallen to chaos, corrupted through the machinations of the Word-Bearers and their dark rituals on Devon. The sons of Horus, Emperor's children, Death Guard, and World Eaters that arrived at Isstvan III included both loyalist and traitor elements. Horus intended to use the campaign as cover for purging those within his legions who would not follow him into rebellion against the Emperor. The battle that followed was not truly about reclaiming Isstvan III for the Imperium, but about Horus eliminating potential opposition to his planned heresy. The loyalist Space Marines who deployed to Isstvan III's surface found a world transformed. The Choral City, the planetary capital, had been warped by chaos influence. Architecture had been modified to incorporate disturbing aesthetic elements, surfaces carved with symbols that hurt to look at, public spaces repurposed for ritual activities. The population had either embraced chaos or been enslaved by those who had. The distinction often unclear as corrupted citizens claimed to have been liberated rather than conquered. The Warsingers led coordinated defences, their abilities making conventional tactical doctrine less effective, their presence on the battlefield creating zones where reality itself seemed malleable. The fighting that erupted when Loyalist Space Marines engaged Praal's forces demonstrated the supernatural capabilities that Slaanesh worship had granted the defenders. Cultists fought with enhanced speed and strength, their bodies warped by chaos blessings into forms that should not have been viable, yet functioned with disturbing efficiency. Demons manifested on the battlefield, summoned through rituals that the cultists had been preparing since the campaign began. Entities of pure sensation and excess that killed with touches that induced lethal ecstasy or agonizing pleasure. The ancient magics of the Istvanian Siren Hold were unleashed. Whatever pre-Imperial powers had been sealed on that world released by cultists, who had learned to manipulate forces that predated humanity's presence in the system. The virus bombing that Horus ordered was not primarily about suppressing the rebellion. It was about eliminating loyalist Space Marines whom Horus could not trust to follow him into heresy. 12 billion people died in that bombardment, their organic matter consumed by the Life Eater virus in minutes, their deaths feeding the Ruinous Powers with a psychic scream that echoed across the galaxy. The firestorm that followed the virus bombing sterilized the planet's surface, melting hive structures and reducing cities to glowing slag. Isstvan III became a dead world. Its corruption ended not through reconquest, but through annihilation. Yet the pattern established on Isstvan III would repeat across the galaxy throughout the Horus heresy and the millennia that followed. Chaos corruption spreading through patient infiltration of planetary leadership, through exploitation of human weakness and frustration with Imperial authority, through gradual normalization of transgressive behavior until open heresy became possible. The case demonstrated that no world was safe simply by virtue of being Imperial, that compliance meant nothing if the corruption occurred slowly enough to evade detection. Isstvan III's fall was a template, a proof of concept that would be refined and repeated by chaos cultists on thousands of worlds. The mechanisms of corruption varied depending on which chaos god was being served. While Slaanesh worship spread through appeals to sensation and the promise of transcendent experience, corruption by other powers followed different patterns suited to their particular natures. The Word-Bearers, the first Space Marine Legion to fall completely to chaos, demonstrated how Tzeentchian influence could work through intellectual corruption, through the promise of knowledge and understanding beyond what the Imperium permitted its citizens to pursue. Their methodology proved even more insidious than the Slaanesh approach, as it could cloak itself in the guise of scholarship and philosophical inquiry. The Word-Bearers had been corrupted decades before the Horus heresy began in earnest. Primarch Lorgar's obsessive religious devotion to the Emperor had been forcibly rejected by the Emperor himself during the humiliation at Monarchia, where the entire legion was forced to kneel while the Emperor destroyed one of their greatest works. This public castigation drove Lorgar to seek gods who would accept worship, and his first chaplain Erebus and Master of the Faith Corps Phaeron guided him toward the Ruinous Powers. The Legion's corruption was accomplished through what they called the Pilgrimage, a journey to worlds where chaos had left its mark, where the primordial truth of chaos's existence could be experienced directly. The Word-Bearers understood that corruption required preparation, that populations needed to be made receptive before overt chaos worship could be introduced. They developed techniques for gradually undermining faith in the Imperial truth, for planting doubts about the Emperor's divinity, even as they pretended to worship him more fervently than any other legion. The warrior lodges they established throughout the Space Marine legions served as mechanisms for this corruption, creating spaces where Astartes could gather away from their officers, where ideas could be exchanged that would never be voiced in official settings, where bonds of brotherhood could be forged that would eventually supersede loyalty to the Emperor. The lodges operated on principles of secrecy and gradual revelation. New members were not immediately exposed to chaos doctrine. Instead, they were encouraged to discuss grievances with Imperial leadership, to question orders that seemed unjust or wasteful, to prioritize loyalty to their brothers over abstract duty to distant terror. These were not inherently heretical positions. Many loyal Space Marines harbored similar frustrations without falling to chaos. But the lodges created an environment where such thoughts could be vocalized and validated, where the psychological barriers against questioning authority could be worn down through repeated exposure to anti-Imperial sentiment. As lodge members became more comfortable voicing doubts, more explicit challenges to Imperial doctrine were introduced. The Emperor's prohibition against religious worship was questioned, with lodge brothers arguing that humanity needed something to believe in beyond mere secular governance. The Imperial truth's denial of chaos was criticized as dangerous ignorance, leaving humanity vulnerable to threats it refused to acknowledge. Alternative spiritual frameworks were discussed in abstract terms, never explicitly advocating chaos worship but creating intellectual space where such ideas could eventually take root. The progression was so gradual that individual lodge members often could not identify the moment when philosophical discussion crossed into actual heresy. The Word-Bearers also developed networks of mortal cultists across worlds they visited during the Great Crusade. These groups were established under cover of spreading the Imperial cult, the Word-Bearers' reputation for piety providing perfect cover for their true activities. They recruited populations who were dissatisfied with Imperial governance, who felt marginalized or exploited by the authorities, who harbored grievances that made them receptive to alternative visions of how society should be organized. The cultists were taught that chaos represented liberation from the Imperium's tyranny, that the ruinous powers offered paths to transcendence and empowerment that the Emperor denied to all but his chosen few. These cult networks remained dormant for years or even decades, their members maintaining appearances of loyalty while gradually spreading chaos influence through their communities. They infiltrated planetary governments, security forces, commercial enterprises, religious institutions. They established communication networks that operated below Imperial surveillance, using codes and dead drops and occasionally psychic contact to coordinate activities across entire sectors. When the Horus Heresy finally began, these cult networks activated simultaneously across hundreds of worlds, erupting into open rebellion that seemed to come from nowhere, but which had actually been carefully prepared over decades. The Battle of Calth demonstrated the full application of Word-Bearers' corruption methodology on a massive scale. Calth was a thriving industrial world within Ultramar, the realm of the Ultramarines Legion, and one of the most heavily fortified systems in the Imperium. Its corruption was accomplished not through gradual infiltration of its population, but through the mass deployment of cultist auxiliaries who travelled with the Word-Bearers' fleet, hidden among what appeared to be legitimate Imperial army support forces. These cultists included several distinct groups, each serving specific functions in the overall plan for Calth's destruction. The Brotherhood of the Knife was a chaos cult that had been operating within the Mechanicum. Its members corrupted tech priests who had embraced forbidden knowledge and made pacts with powers from the warp. They were responsible for introducing the Octid, a form of scrap code that was part technological virus and part chaos ritual, into Calth's data networks. This scrap code disrupted communications, disabled defensive systems, and created the conditions necessary for the Word-Bearers' surprise attack to succeed. The Brotherhood's corruption of machine spirits and data systems demonstrated that chaos could infect not just biological entities, but the technological infrastructure that supported human civilization. The Tzenvar Cowl, also called the Recursive Family, consisted of thousands of abhumans and mutants whose presence in the Word-Bearers' auxiliary forces had been explained as feral world levies. In reality, they were devoted chaos cultists, whose physical mutations were marks of their patron's favour. They were deployed for hazardous environment operations and clearance duties, tasks that exposed them to extreme danger, but which positioned them to conduct rituals in locations where the veil between real space and the warp was particularly thin. The cowl laid out circles of summoning stones taken from Isstvan III, each marked with blasphemous sigils, creating ritual circuits across Calth's surface that would serve as focal points for demonic manifestation. The cultists began their rituals 60 hours before the word-bearers launched their attack. The chanting was constant, monotonous incantations in languages that predated humanity, psychic pressure building across the planet as the barriers between dimensions were systematically weakened. The Ultramarines remaining Psykers, who had been forbidden to use their abilities following the Council of Nicaea's edict, experienced severe headaches and pain, but dismissed these symptoms as fatigue. They did not report them to their superiors, did not communicate with each other about the shared experience, following the Emperor's decree even as it prevented them from recognizing the danger approaching Calth. When the word-bearers finally struck, the cultists' role shifted from preparation to active combat. They served as human waves assaulting Ultramarines' positions, their lives spent freely to exhaust the defenders' ammunition and identify strong points. They drove Calth's civilian population from shelter into killing zones, where word-bearers' bombardment could slaughter them en masse. Every death served the larger ritual Lorgar had designed, the ruin storm that would split the galaxy and isolate terror from reinforcement. The cultists died willingly, convinced that their sacrifice would be rewarded by the gods they served, that death in the service of chaos was preferable to survival without having earned the Ruinous Powers' notice. The most critical ritual was conducted by First Chaplain Erebus on the Satric Plateau, north of Numinous City. The location had been selected for specific properties, the immaterium vectors aligning perfectly in that region, the barrier between real space and the warp naturally thin enough that massive demonic manifestation would be possible with the proper preparation. Erebus was joined by Asemba Zot, one of the Gal Vorbak, the first Chaos Space Marines to achieve full demonic possession. The ritual they conducted was the culmination of everything the word-bearers had worked toward, designed to tear reality open and summon legions of demons to fight alongside the traitor forces. The summoning succeeded beyond even Lorgar's expectations. Demons poured through the breach Erebus created, entities from all 4 Chaos gods manifesting on Calth's surface and joining the slaughter. The raw stuff of the warp bled into reality, stretching and wearing the fabric of space until physical laws became suggestions rather than absolute rules. Ultramarines who engaged these demons found their weapons less effective than they should have been, bolt rounds passing through demonic flesh without inflicting lethal damage, power weapons cutting entities that regenerated almost as quickly as they were damaged. The demons killed with methods that violated biological possibility, touches that aged victims centuries in seconds, gazes that drove Astartes insane despite their conditioning against psychological warfare, voices that shattered ceramite armor through sonic pressure alone. The Ultramarines' resistance was heroic but ultimately futile against the scale of corruption unleashed on Calth. Robert Guilliman himself led the defense, his tactical genius allowing loyal forces to mount a more effective response than the word-bearers had anticipated. Captain Ventanus recaptured Calth's defense laser silos, turning the planet's own weapons against the traitor fleet. Ultramarines secured fortified positions and coordinated their actions into a coherent defensive strategy, despite communications being compromised. But they were fighting a battle that had already been lost before it began, the corruption too extensive, the demonic presence too powerful, the damage to Calth's infrastructure too severe for any recovery to be possible. The ruin storm that Erebus summoned was the true objective. The demons, the slaughter, the corruption of Calth's population, all of it served to create the psychic resonance necessary for this warp storm's birth. When the ritual reached its climax, a massive rent in reality tore across the eastern fringe, separating Ultramar from the rest of the Imperium, preventing Guilliman's forces from reinforcing terror during the climactic battles of the Horus Heresy. The storm persisted for years, its influence spreading corruption to surrounding systems, making interstellar travel in the region nearly impossible, ensuring that the traitor legions could advance on Terra without interference from one of the Imperium's largest and most powerful military forces. Calth itself became a wasteland. Its sun was poisoned by the word-bearers, transformed into a source of lethal radiation that made the surface uninhabitable. The surviving population retreated into underground cities, the Calth underworld war continuing for years as ultramarines hunted the remaining wordbearers and cultists through kilometers of tunnels and caverns. The world's corruption was never fully purged. Even after the Horus heresy ended and some measure of stability returned to the region, Calth remained scarred by what had been done to it, its population permanently reduced, its infrastructure crippled, serving as eternal testimony to what chaos could accomplish when given the opportunity to strike without warning. The patterns demonstrated at Isstvan III and Calth revealed fundamental principles about how chaos corruption spreads through planetary populations. The process is never random or chaotic despite the name of the powers involved. It follows methodologies refined over millions of years, techniques developed by entities whose existence spans timescales incomprehensible to mortal minds. The Ruinous Powers understand human psychology with perfect clarity, know exactly which weaknesses to exploit, which promises to make, which fears to amplify. They have corrupted countless civilizations across galactic history and learned from every success and failure. The initial infection always targets leadership and influence networks. Chaos cannot corrupt an entire world simultaneously. It lacks the presence in real space to manifest everywhere at once, and attempting to do so would trigger immediate Imperial response. Instead, corruption begins with individuals who possess authority, resources, or cultural influence. Planetary governors like Vardus Praal are ideal targets because their corruption provides protection for cult activities and access to governmental resources. Military officers can divert weapons and suppress investigations. Tech priests can manipulate data systems and disable security measures. Ecclesiarchy officials can provide theological cover for heretical activities by proclaiming certain practices acceptable or by focusing enforcement efforts away from genuine threats. The corruption of leadership creates safe spaces where cult activities can occur without immediate discovery. Once these spaces exist, recruitment can accelerate. The cults do not advertise their presence or actively seek converts among the general population. Such approaches would alert authorities and risk exposure before the corruption was strong enough to survive suppression efforts. Instead, recruitment occurs through social networks, with existing cult members identifying individuals in their circles who display characteristics suggesting receptivity to chaos influence. These prospects are approached carefully, tested through ambiguous conversations and invitations to gatherings that could be explained as innocent if the prospect proves unreceptive. The gatherings themselves are structured to gradually erode resistance to heretical ideas. Early meetings involve no explicit chaos content, focusing instead on building community, validating grievances against Imperial authority, providing experiences that are prohibited but not obviously dangerous. Alcohol, recreational drugs, sexual activities outside approved procreation protocols, intellectual discussions of forbidden topics, all of these can serve as entry points for corruption. The key is that participants take voluntary steps into transgression, making choices that compromise their ability to report cult activities without incriminating themselves. Each step creates psychological investment in continuing, makes turning back more difficult, binds the individual more tightly to the group. As prospects become more deeply involved, explicit chaos content is introduced incrementally. Discussion of the warp as a source of power rather than merely a navigation medium. Acknowledgement that entities exist in the immaterium that possess intelligence and agency. Philosophical arguments about whether these entities deserve the designation of demons or might better be understood as alternative forms of a life. Consideration of whether the Emperor's prohibition against warp interaction reflects genuine wisdom or simply his desire to monopolize power. These discussions are framed as intellectual exploration rather than heresy, participants encouraged to think critically and reach their own conclusions even as the entire framework of discussion pushes them toward chaos-compatible positions. Ritual practice begins with activities that seem symbolic rather than literally supernatural. Chants in unknown languages are presented as historical reenactments or artistic performance. Geometric patterns drawn on floors are explained as meditation aids or aesthetic experimentation. Offerings of food or objects are framed as traditional practices from pre-imperial cultures, harmless acknowledgements of historical continuity. Participants engage in these activities without fully understanding their significance, creating psychic resonances that weaken the barrier between real space and the warp without recognizing what they are doing. By the time actual demon summoning occurs, participants have been so thoroughly prepared that many accept the manifestation as expected rather than horrifying. The corruption timelines vary enormously depending on circumstances. Planetary governors with access to resources and protection can be corrupted in a few years of intensive attention. Ordinary citizens with no particular influence might require decades of gradual exposure before they are useful to cult objectives. Space Marine legions corrupted through warrior lodges took the better part of a century, the process beginning before the Horus Heresy and accelerating during the Great Crusade as lodge networks expanded. The word-bearers themselves underwent transformation over 40 years, from the Emperor's rebuke at Monarchia to their full emergence as Chaos worshippers during the opening moves of Horus's rebellion. What remains constant across all corruption timelines is patience. Chaos is not in a hurry. The Ruinous Powers exist partially outside linear time, perceive causality in ways that mortal minds cannot comprehend. They are willing to invest decades or even centuries corrupting a single world if that world's fall will serve their larger purposes. They can maintain dozens or hundreds of corruption efforts simultaneously across the galaxy, accepting that many will fail, that Imperial authorities will discover and suppress some cults before they achieve their objectives. The Chaos Gods possess infinite time and can afford to lose individual battles as long as the overall war continues. The psychological mechanisms of corruption exploit fundamental aspects of human nature that the Emperor's secular vision for humanity could not eliminate. Humans desire meaning and purpose beyond mere existence. They seek community and belonging. They want recognition for their efforts and validation of their worth. They struggle with mortality and search for transcendence. The Imperial truth addressed none of these needs, offering only duty, sacrifice, and the promise that future generations would benefit from current suffering. For many, this was insufficient. The Chaos Gods offered immediate gratification, personal empowerment, and direct experience of the divine. The choice between grinding service to a distant emperor and the embrace of powers that actually responded to worship proved less difficult than Imperial authorities assumed. The role of psykers in planetary corruption cannot be overstated. Even minor psychic talent makes individuals exponentially more useful to chaos cults. Untrained psykers create vulnerabilities in reality through their mere existence, their unconscious connection to the warp producing effects they do not understand and cannot control. Chaos cults actively seek out these individuals, offering them training and community that the Imperium denies to all but those subjected to soul-binding or recruitment into the Astra Militarum. A cult with even one trained psyker can accomplish far more than groups relying solely on ritual and faith, able to perform summonings, manipulate perceptions, and strike at enemies through supernatural means. The black ships that harvested psykers from Imperial worlds were supposed to prevent this problem. By identifying and removing psychically active individuals before they could be corrupted, the Imperium aimed to eliminate one of Chaos's primary vectors for infiltration. But the system was imperfect. The Imperium contained 1 million worlds, far more than the black ships could regularly monitor. Psykers born between harvests could operate for years before being detected. Some learned to hide their talents, avoiding the soul binding that would have protected them from corruption, but also prevented them from conscious use of their abilities. Others were deliberately concealed by family or community members who valued their talents more than Imperial law. The mutations that accompanied chaos worship served as both marker and mechanism of corruption. Physical changes indicated that an individual had been touched by warp energies, that their body was adapting to accommodate forces that normal human biology could not sustain. These mutations range from subtle alterations that could be concealed under clothing to grotesque transformations that left individuals barely recognizable as human. The Chaos Gods use mutations as blessings and curses simultaneously, granting power and capability while marking the blessed as fundamentally separate from uncorrupted humanity, making it impossible for them to return to normal life even if they wished to do so. Some mutations enhanced combat capability, providing natural weapons or armored skin or enhanced strength. These were particularly valued by Cornete cults, whose members sought physical might above all else. Other mutations affected perception or cognition, granting senses beyond normal human capacity or mental processes that could comprehend patterns invisible to unaugmented minds. Tzeentchian cultists welcomed these changes, viewing them as steps toward transcendence beyond merely biological existence. Nurglite mutations typically involve disease and decay that somehow did not kill the afflicted, granting resilience and the ability to spread corruption through touch. Slaanesh mutations often combined beauty and horror, creating forms that were simultaneously attractive and repulsive, fascinating and disturbing. The demon engines that corrupted tech priests created represented a particularly dangerous fusion of chaos corruption and advanced technology. These devices bound demonic entities into mechanical housings, creating weapons and vehicles that combine the durability of machinery with the supernatural capabilities of warp entities. The Dark Mechanicum excelled at this craft, having abandoned the Omnissiah's doctrine in favour of direct pacts with the Ruinous Powers. Their creations operated according to principles that violated the understanding of physics that mainstream tech priests possessed, drawing power from impossible sources, moving in ways that should not have been achievable with the components they visibly possessed, responding to their operators' intentions in ways that suggested genuine intelligence rather than mere programmatic response. The creation of demon engines required sacrifice of both materials and lives, binding rituals that consumed cultists to provide psychic fuel for the summoning and imprisonment of warp entities. The demons themselves rarely cooperated willingly with their imprisonment. They were forced into mechanical housings through rituals of compulsion, bound by true names and geometric constraints, their power channeled and directed according to their creators' designs. The engines frequently rebelled against their constraints, requiring constant maintenance and additional sacrifices to maintain control. But when functioning properly, they represented military assets of extraordinary power, capable of feats that conventional Imperial technology could not match. The Word-bearers had perfected these techniques before the Horus heresy began, their dark apostles teaching corrupted tech priests the principles of demon binding and warp tech integration. The knowledge spread to other traitor legions during the war, with the Death Guard and Thousand Sons developing their own variations suited to their patron god's characteristics. Nurglite demon engines were virtually indestructible, their mechanical components rotting and regenerating continuously, their demonic inhabitants spreading disease through every battlefield they traversed. Tzeentchian engines warped reality around themselves, making space unreliable in their vicinity, teleporting without visible mechanisms or shifting dimensions to avoid attacks. Cornity engines were simply unstoppable, driving forward with mechanical implacability enhanced by demonic fury, killing everything in their path regardless of casualties or tactical considerations. The full manifestation stage of planetary corruption occurred when the cults judged themselves strong enough to survive Imperial response, or when circumstances forced them to reveal themselves prematurely. This was the moment when whispers and shadows gave way to open declaration, when demons manifested in real space in significant numbers, when the corruption that had been growing invisibly suddenly became impossible to deny or ignore. The transition was always catastrophic. Worlds that had seemed stable and loyal erupted into civil war within hours, as cultists activated simultaneously across all major population centres. Planetary defence forces found themselves fighting their own officers. Arbites discovered that their investigations had been compromised from within. Governors who had thought themselves secure learned that their own guards had been corrupted. Imperial authorities' capacity to respond to these crises was limited by the vast scale of the Imperium and the time required to marshal military forces for planetary reconquest. Even when rebellion was detected early, weeks or months might pass before Space Marine chapters or Imperial Guard regiments could reach the corrupted world. This delay allowed Chaos forces to consolidate control, to complete the summoning rituals that would make reconquest exponentially more difficult, to transform the planetary environment in ways that would require Exterminatus to fully purge. Many corrupted worlds were not reclaimed at all, the Imperium instead declaring them lost and establishing quarantine zones to prevent the corruption from spreading to adjacent systems. The Imperial response to planetary chaos corruption follows established protocols refined over 10 millennia of constant warfare against the Ruinous Powers. When a world falls to heresy, the Inquisition assumes command of all military operations in the system, their authority superseding even that of Space Marine chapter masters or Lord Commanders of the Astra Militarum. The Order Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition specialised in combating demonic threats, takes particular interest in worlds where chaos worship has progressed to the point of sustained demonic manifestation. These inquisitors possess knowledge forbidden to ordinary Imperial citizens, understanding of how demons function and the rituals required to banish them, expertise purchased at the cost of exposure to corrupting influences that would destroy weaker minds, the Grey Knights represent the Imperium's most specialised tool for combating demonic incursions. This chapter of Space Marines was created during the final days of the Horus Heresy by Malcador the Sigillite, who gathered 8 Space Marines from both Loyalist and Traitor legions, along with 4 Mortal Lords and Administrators to form the foundation of an order dedicated entirely to fighting chaos. Every Grey Knight is a powerful psyker, their psychic abilities channeled through extensive training into a protective aura called the Aegis that makes them anathema to demonic entities. They are equipped with Nemesis force weapons that channel psychic energy to inflict damage on a demon's fundamental essence rather than merely its physical manifestation. Their armour is left unpainted, the natural silver-grey of ceramite exposed and covered with protective wards and purity seals that provide additional defence against warp corruption. The Grey Knights hold a unique distinction among all Space Marine chapters. In over 10,000 years of service, not a single Grey Knight has ever fallen to chaos corruption. This perfect record is not accidental but the result of the most rigorous selection and training processes in the Imperium. Aspirants are chosen from among psychers whose minds have been deeply probed to ensure no hint of corruption exists. The gene seed used to create Grey Knights is specially crafted to be resistant to warp influence. Their training includes extensive exposure to chaos in controlled environments, learning to resist temptation and corruption through direct experience while protected by their instructors and the Fortress Monastery's wards. By the time a Grey Knight is ready for combat deployment, his mind and soul have been forged into weapons as deadly to demons as the blade he carries. When a corrupted world is identified, the Inquisition's first assessment determines whether reconquest is feasible or if Exterminatus is required. This decision weighs multiple factors including the extent of corruption, the strategic value of the world, the size of the demonic presence, and the availability of military forces sufficient to purge the planet. Exterminatus is not ordered lightly. It represents the destruction of an entire world, the death of billions of Imperial citizens, the loss of infrastructure and resources that took centuries to develop. But when corruption has progressed beyond certain thresholds, when the population has been so thoroughly tainted that no redemption is possible, when demons have established permanent manifestation and begun transforming the world's physical reality, Exterminatus becomes the only option that prevents the corruption from spreading to surrounding systems. The methods of Exterminatus vary depending on available resources and the nature of the target. Cyclonic torpedoes penetrate deep into a planet's crust before detonating, creating chain reactions in the mantle that crack the world's surface and boil away the atmosphere. Virus bombing releases the Life Eater virus, which consumes all organic matter on a planetary scale in a matter of hours, followed by incendiary bombardment that ignites the gases produced by rapid decomposition. Atmospheric incineration uses sustained lance strikes and plasma bombardment to superheat a world's atmosphere until the surface becomes uninhabitable. Two-stage cyclonic bombardment combines conventional explosives with fusion warheads to achieve complete planetary destruction. Each method is designed to ensure that no trace of chaos corruption survives, that the demons are banished back to the warp, that the tainted population is cleansed by fire. The aftermath of the First War for Armageddon demonstrated both the necessity of such measures and their terrible cost. Armageddon, a strategically vital hive world, was invaded by the forces of the demon primarch Angron, who manifested on the planet's surface with a host of Khornate demons and World Eaters, Chaos Space Marines. The Space Wolves chapter responded to the incursion, fighting alongside the Armageddon PDF and Imperial Guard regiments in a brutal campaign that lasted months. The Grey Knights deployed in force, their intervention ultimately proving decisive when they banished Angron himself back to the warp at tremendous cost. The immediate military threat was defeated, the demonic presence purged, the planet saved from complete corruption. But victory in the military sense did not solve the problem of the surviving population. Millions of Imperial citizens had witnessed demons, had seen the Grey Knights in action, had been exposed to knowledge of chaos that Imperial doctrine deemed too dangerous for civilians to possess. The Inquisition's response was systematic and merciless. The Imperial Guard regiments that had fought on Armageddon were purged, their soldiers either mind-wiped or executed to prevent the spread of information about what they had witnessed. Civilian survivors underwent similar treatment, entire hive blocks sterilized, populations who had seen too much eliminated without trial or appeal. The Space Wolves, who had fought alongside these guard regiments and developed bonds of respect with them, were outraged by these purges and attempted to intervene. The conflict that followed became known as the Months of Shame. The Space Wolves and Grey Knights, two chapters that should have been natural allies in the war against chaos, fought each other over the fate of survivors who the Inquisition had deemed necessary to eliminate. The confrontation escalated to the point where the Space Wolves' Great Wolf Logan Grimnar personally slew Grandmaster Joros of the Grey Knights during a boarding action. The crisis was eventually resolved through negotiation, but not before demonstrating the brutal logic that governed Imperial responses to chaos corruption. Knowledge itself was corrupting. Exposure to demonic entities was contaminating even if the exposed individual never embraced chaos, and the Imperium would sacrifice its own loyal servants by the millions to prevent the spread of taint. This policy of purging survivors and suppressing knowledge about chaos corruption was not merely paranoia, but based on documented cases where seemingly loyal Imperial citizens became corruption vectors. Individuals who witnessed demonic manifestations sometimes developed psychic sensitivity they had not previously possessed, becoming vulnerable to possession or manipulation by warp entities. Others experienced nightmares and visions that gradually eroded their sanity and faith, making them susceptible to cult recruitment. Even those who remained physically and psychologically stable could become sources of information that allowed chaos cults to operate more effectively, their knowledge of how the Imperium responded to corruption enabling cultists to avoid detection. The Grey Knights themselves were not immune to the corrupting influence of sustained exposure to chaos, though they resisted through means unavailable to ordinary humans. After prolonged campaigns against major demonic incursions, Grey Knights underwent extensive purification rituals and psychic examination to ensure no taint had taken root. Those who showed even minor signs of corruption were immediately removed from active duty and subjected to intensive spiritual cleansing. In extreme cases where corruption could not be fully purged, the affected Grey Knight would be granted the Emperor's peace, execution presented as mercy rather than punishment, his sacrifice honoured even as his name was struck from all records to prevent the shame of his fall from tarnishing the chapter's perfect record. When reconquest rather than Exterminatus was deemed feasible, the military campaigns to retake corrupted worlds followed patterns developed through centuries of experience. The first priority was establishing orbital supremacy, ensuring that chaos forces could not receive reinforcements or evacuate key personnel. Preliminary bombardment focused on destroying major cult strongholds and demonic summoning sites, disrupting the rituals that maintained the strongest demonic manifestations. Initial ground deployments targeted command and control infrastructure, killing cult leaders and demon hosts whose destruction would fragment enemy coordination. The actual reconquest proceeded methodically, sectors cleared one at a time, each area subjected to intensive screening to identify and eliminate remaining cultists. The screening process for liberated populations was extensive and unforgiving. Inquisitorial teams examined every survivor, using a combination of interrogation, psychic probing, and physical inspection for signs of mutation or chaos marks. Those found to be genuine victims of corruption rather than willing participants faced mind-wiping at best, execution at worst. The Inquisition operated on the principle that false negatives were more dangerous than false positives, that it was better to kill 100 innocent citizens than allow one corrupted individual to survive and spread taint. This approach resulted in massive casualties among civilian populations even after military victory had been achieved, entire cities depopulated in the name of ensuring purity. The reconsecration of corrupted worlds required years or even decades after the immediate military threat had been eliminated. Ecclesiarchy officials conducted elaborate purification rituals over sites where demons had manifested, sanctifying ground that had been touched by the warp. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus purged machine spirits that might have been contaminated, replacing entire data systems rather than attempting to cleanse corrupted code. Architecture that had been warped by chaos influence was demolished and rebuilt according to approved patterns. Water sources were tested and purified, soil was examined for signs of unnatural taint, atmospheric composition was monitored to ensure no lingering warp energies persisted. The goal was to erase every trace of chaos corruption, to return the world to a state where loyal Imperial citizens could live without risk of exposure. Yet even these extensive measures could not guarantee complete purification. chaos corruption could lie dormant for generations, waiting for the right circumstances to resurface. Cult networks might survive purges by going deeper underground, their members maintaining perfect facades of loyalty, while preserving forbidden knowledge for future use. Demonic entities banished during Reconquest campaigns could be resummoned if anyone who knew the proper rituals survived. Warp taint embedded in the planetary environment might persist despite all efforts at cleansing, creating locations where reality remained thin, and demons could manifest more easily than on uncorrupted worlds. The Inquisition maintained permanent surveillance over worlds that had been reclaimed from chaos, watching for any sign that corruption had returned. The economic and demographic costs of responding to chaos corruption were staggering. Exterminatus eliminated entire planets, removing them permanently from Imperial production and population. Reconquest campaigns consumed military resources that could have been deployed elsewhere. Space Marine chapters and Guard regiments committed to years-long campaigns that prevented them from responding to other threats. The purging of survivors after successful reconquest reduced populations that might otherwise have been productive Imperial citizens. The constant vigilance required to monitor for corruption diverted inquisitorial attention from other duties. Across the Imperium's million worlds, the cumulative effect of these costs represented a substantial drain on the resources available for the broader war against chaos and other threats. The Great Rift's opening at the beginning of the 42nd millennium dramatically escalated the scale of chaos corruption across the galaxy. The massive warp storm that split the Imperium in half created conditions where demonic manifestation became far easier, where worlds that had never been threatened by chaos found themselves under assault by entities from the Immaterium. The Grey Knights found themselves desperately overstretched, responding to demonic incursions across both the Imperium Sanctus and the Dark Imperium beyond the Rift. The loss of many black ships during the opening of the Rift created recruitment problems. Fewer psychers available to become Grey Knight aspirants even as demand for their services increased exponentially. The desperation of this situation forced the Grey Knights to take actions that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. They began raiding other Imperial institutions to seize psychically gifted individuals before the formal recruitment processes could claim them, hiding evidence of their actions to avoid conflict with authorities whose cooperation they still required. They enacted Exterminatus far more liberally than previous doctrine allowed, destroying worlds at the first sign of serious corruption rather than attempting reconquest that would tie up forces needed elsewhere. The perfect record of incorruptibility that the Grey Knights had maintained for 10,000 years remained intact, but the methods required to preserve that record were becoming increasingly extreme. Some corrupted worlds could not be saved even with the most aggressive intervention. When a world had been pulled entirely into the warp, becoming what Imperial authorities classified as a demon world, it existed in a space where the normal laws of physics no longer fully applied. These worlds were ruled by demon princes or greater demons who shaped reality according to their whims, creating nightmare realms where the boundaries between thought and matter had dissolved. Demon worlds within the Eye of Terror had existed for millennia, populated by humans who had been born into chaos worship and knew no other existence. Attempts to liberate such worlds invariably failed, the combination of demonic power and environmental hazards too extreme for conventional military forces to overcome. The lesson that 10,000 years of fighting chaos had taught the Imperium was that prevention was infinitely preferable to cure. Once corruption had taken root and progressed beyond the earlier stages, the options available to Imperial authorities were uniformly terrible, requiring either massive military commitments that might fail anyway, or exterminatus that destroyed the very world they were trying to save. This understanding drove the Inquisition's obsessive focus on identifying and eliminating corruption before it could metastasize, the willingness to execute suspects based on minimal evidence, the systematic suppression of any knowledge about chaos that might make citizens more vulnerable to corruption. Yet prevention was imperfect by its nature. The Imperium was too vast, contained too many worlds, had too many citizens for comprehensive surveillance of every individual who might be susceptible to chaos influence. The Ruinous Powers were patient beyond human comprehension, willing to spend centuries corrupting a single world, maintaining multiple corruption efforts simultaneously across the galaxy, with the expectation that most would be discovered and suppressed before achieving their objectives. The mathematics of the situation favoured chaos. They only needed one corruption effort to succeed in order to claim a world. The Imperium needed to prevent every single attempt to maintain its holdings. Over time, the cumulative effect of this asymmetry meant that chaos gained ground despite the Imperium's best efforts. The survivors of corrupted worlds who were deemed pure enough to live faced lifelong consequences of their exposure. Those who had been mind-wiped lost significant portions of their memories, their personalities fundamentally altered by the removal of experiences deemed too dangerous to preserve. They were typically resettled on frontier worlds far from their original homes, given new identities, watched carefully for any sign that suppressed memories might resurface. Those who had witnessed corruption but whose memories were left intact carried psychological scars that never fully healed, nightmares and flashbacks that persisted decades after their ordeal. Many developed extreme paranoia, seeing signs of chaos corruption everywhere, reporting neighbours and colleagues to authorities on minimal evidence. These survivors served a useful function for the Inquisition despite the trauma they bore. Their experiences made them exceptionally effective at identifying early-stage corruption, recognizing patterns of behavior and social dynamics that indicated cult activity. Some were recruited into inquisitorial retinues, their damaged psyches considered acceptable prices for the expertise they provided. Others were employed as informants and investigators, their knowledge of how corruption spread allowing them to infiltrate suspect populations and identify genuine threats. The Inquisition maintained careful oversight of these individuals, aware that the same experiences that made them useful also made them potentially vulnerable to genuine corruption if they ever lost faith in the Emperor's protection. The theological implications of chaos corruption posed problems that the ecclesiarchy struggled to address coherently. Imperial doctrine taught that the Emperor was omnipotent and benevolent, that faith in him provided absolute protection against evil. Yet the reality that entire worlds fell to chaos despite their population's nominal loyalty to the Emperor suggested that faith alone was insufficient. The ecclesiarchy's response was to declare that fallen worlds had been insufficiently faithful, that their corruption proved they had never been true believers, that genuine devotion would have protected them. This position was logically consistent but psychologically brutal, asking survivors to accept that their fallen neighbours and families had been secret heretics all along, that the communities they remembered had been corrupt even when they appeared loyal. The long-term sustainability of the Imperium's approach to chaos corruption remained questionable. Every world that fell to chaos and required Exterminatus was a permanent loss, removed from the Imperium's productive capacity forever. Every population that had to be purged after liberation represented human resources that could never be recovered. Every Space Marine chapter and Guard regiment committed to anti-corruption campaigns was unavailable for the Imperium's other wars. The cumulative drain of these losses over millennia had reduced the Imperium from its peak during the Great Crusade to its current embattled state, holding territory through force of will more than genuine strength. Some radical inquisitors argued that the Imperium's approach to chaos corruption was fundamentally flawed, that the extreme secrecy and suppression of knowledge about the Ruinous Powers actually made citizens more vulnerable rather than less. They contended that if the population understood what chaos actually was and how corruption worked, they would be better equipped to recognize and resist it. These arguments were rejected by the Inquisition's mainstream, which maintained that any widespread knowledge about chaos would inevitably lead to increased corruption, as the curious and the desperate sought out the powers that official doctrine denied existed. The debate remained unresolved, each side able to point to evidence supporting their position, neither able to prove definitively that their approach would work better. The future of the Imperium's struggle against chaos corruption appeared grim by any objective assessment. The Great Rift had created conditions where corruption spread more easily and demonic incursions occurred more frequently. The loss of half the Imperium's territory to the Dark Imperium reduced the resources available for anti-corruption efforts. The Grey Knights were stretched to the breaking point, unable to respond to every demonic incursion that required their specialized capabilities. The Inquisition's networks had been disrupted by the Cicatrix Maledictum, making coordination and information sharing more difficult. Yet the fight continued because the alternative was extinction, because allowing chaos to spread unopposed would doom humanity to a fate worse than death. The pattern of corruption from whispers to cults, to demonic manifestation to planetary damnation, had repeated across thousands of worlds throughout Imperial history. Each instance possessed unique characteristics shaped by local conditions and the specific chaos powers involved. but the fundamental progression remained consistent. The Ruinous Powers had refined their methodology over millions of years, learning from every success and failure, adapting their approaches to exploit the particular vulnerabilities of each target population. They possessed patience beyond mortal comprehension and resources that appeared infinite from a human perspective. Against such enemies, the Imperium could only maintain eternal vigilance, accepting that preventing every corruption attempt was impossible, but fighting to limit the damage when prevention failed. This was the grim reality of existence in a galaxy where chaos was an eternal threat, where corruption could emerge anywhere at any time, where the price of civilization was measured in worlds destroyed and populations purged in the name of preventing even worse catastrophes.